Imagine you're walking down the street and you see a man controlling a dog with a leash. The dog trots along seemingly happy, but every step it takes is determined by the man's pull on the leash. Now, imagine if that man were God and the dog were you. Would you still feel free? This might sound like a strange comparison, but it gets to the heart of a deep theological and philosophical debate. Does God's control over the universe mean that we are just puppets, or can we still be truly free and morally responsible for our actions? Welcome to the world of Calvinism and the debate over free will and determinism. Calvinism, named after the 16th century reformer John Calvin, teaches that God is in complete control of everything that happens. This includes every choice you make, every action you take, and every thought that crosses your mind. According to this view, God has a plan, and everything that happens is part of that plan. But if that's true, how can we be held responsible for our actions? How can we be blamed for sin if we're just following God's script? This is a question that has puzzled people for centuries. In the Bible, the Apostle Paul addresses this very issue in the book of Romans. After explaining God's sovereign choice in salvation, he anticipates two objections. If God controls everything, including our sins, isn't he to blame for evil? If God's will is absolute, how can we be held responsible for our choices? These questions are still asked today, and they're as relevant as ever. Critics of Calvinism argue that if God determines everything, then we lose our free will and moral responsibility. They say that if God is in control, then he must be the author of sin, and that makes him unjust. But what if there's another way to look at it? What if we can still be free and responsible, even if God is in control? This is the heart of the debate between compatibilism and libertarianism. Compatibilism is the idea that free will and determinism can coexist. According to compatibilists, you can be free as long as you act according to your desires and character, even if those desires and character are determined by God. Libertarianism, on the other hand, argues that true free will requires the ability to choose otherwise. If God determines your choices, you can't truly be free. So are we, like the dog on the leash, or are we free agents with the power to choose? This book will explore these questions, diving deep into the arguments for and against compatibilism and libertarianism. We'll look at what the Bible says, what philosophers have argued, and what it all means for our understanding of God and human responsibility. But before we dive in, let's take a closer look at why this matters. The stakes are high. If compatibilism is true, it means that God is in control, and we are still responsible for our actions. If libertarianism is true, it means that we have the power to choose independently of God. But it also raises questions about God's sovereignty and the problem of evil. So, are you ready to explore this fascinating and complex topic? Let's begin by examining the core of the debate: free will, pets, and puppets. Imagine you're playing a game of chess, and every move you make is predetermined by the rules and the initial setup of the pieces. This idea that everything that happens is determined by prior conditions is called determinism. Whether you believe in God or not, determinism can be understood in different ways. If you think the universe runs according to natural laws, determinism means that everything is set in motion by those laws. If you believe in God, it means that God has a plan, and everything happens according to that plan. For example, if you believe in a natural physical version of determinism, you might think that the laws of physics and chemistry determine everything from the weather to your thoughts. But if you believe in a theological version, you might think that God is the one who sets everything in motion, including your choices. Both versions are types of determinism, and they both face the same big question. If everything is determined, can we still be responsible for our actions? On the other side of the coin is indeterminism, which is the idea that not everything is determined. In this view, there are events that are not fully controlled by prior conditions. For example, you might believe that your decisions are not predetermined by the laws of nature or by God's plan. Instead, you have the freedom to make choices that are truly your own. Now, let's talk about Calvinism. Calvinism is a way of thinking about God and human choices that is closely tied to determinism. It's named after John Calvin, a famous theologian from the 16th century. Calvinists believe that God has a plan for everything, including who will be saved and who won't. They often use the term tulip to describe their main beliefs. Total depravity, humans are inherently sinful, unconditional election, God chooses who will be saved, limited, atonement, Jesus' death only applies to the elect, irresistible grace, if God chooses you, you will be saved, and perseverance of the saints, once saved, always saved. In the context of determinism, Calvinists believe that God determines everything, including human choices. This is called theological determinism. Some people who call themselves Calvinists might argue about whether this belief is necessary, but for the purpose of this discussion, we'll use Calvinism to mean that God determines everything. Moral responsibility is another key concept. When we say someone is morally responsible for an action, we mean they can be praised or blamed for it. For example, if you help someone in need, you can be praised for your kindness. If you hurt someone, you can be blamed for your actions. Compatibilism and incompatibilism are two ways of thinking about how determinism and moral responsibility relate. Compatibilists believe that determinism and moral responsibility can coexist. They think that even if everything is determined, we can still be responsible for our actions. Incompatibilists, on the other hand, believe that if everything is determined, we can't be responsible for our actions. They think that for us to be truly responsible, we must have free will, the ability to make choices that are not determined by prior conditions. Libertarianism is a specific form of incompatibilism. Libertarians believe that free will is incompatible with determinism, and that we must have the ability to choose freely for moral responsibility to exist. They often talk about the ability to do otherwise, the idea that in any situation you could have chosen differently. Finally, Arminianism is the opposite of Calvinism when it comes to free will. Named after Jacob Arminius, Arminians believe in libertarian free will, the idea that humans have the ability to make free choices that are not determined by God or natural laws. Arminians think that God gives us the freedom to choose, and our choices can affect our salvation. Understanding these concepts is crucial for diving into the debates about Calvinism and moral responsibility. Whether you believe in determinism or indeterminism, Calvinism or Arminianism, the big question is, can we still be responsible for our actions if everything is determined? This is a question that has puzzled thinkers for centuries, and it's one we'll explore further in the coming chapters. When people say that if Calvinism is true, humans don't have free will, they often mean that we don't make real choices. They think that if everything is determined by God, then we can't be truly responsible for our actions. But this argument can be a bit tricky. Imagine you're playing a game where all your moves are decided by someone else. You might think, I'm not really playing, I'm just following orders. This is how some people feel about Calvinism. They argue that if God determines everything, we don't really choose anything. And if we don't choose, we can't be responsible. But let's break this down. When people say free will, they often mean libertarian free will, which is the idea that we can choose anything we want without any outside influence. Calvinists don't believe in this kind of free will. Instead, they believe that our choices are determined by God, but we still make real choices. It's like when your parents decide what you should eat for dinner, but you still choose which seat to sit in at the table. So if the argument is that determinism means no free will, and no free will means no moral responsibility, the Calvinist might say, not so fast. They would argue that free will doesn't have to mean libertarian free will. It can just mean that we have the freedom to act in a way that makes us responsible for our actions. For example, if you steal a cookie, you're still responsible for that action, even if God determined that you would do it. Another way people argue against Calvinism is by saying that if our choices are determined, we're like pets or puppets. They use colorful metaphors like puppets on strings or robots. The idea is that if God is controlling everything, we're not really in control at all, and that means we can't be responsible for our actions. But think about it this way. Pets and puppets don't have the same kind of control over their actions that humans do. A pet follows its instincts, and the puppet moves because someone else is pulling the strings. But humans are different. Even if God determines our actions, we still have the ability to understand what we're doing and to act based on our own desires and beliefs. For example, imagine you're playing a video game, and the game developer has programmed your character to make certain choices. You still feel like you're making those choices, and you're still responsible for them, even though the developer set up the game that way. Similarly, Calvinists believe that even if God determines our choices, we still have the freedom to act in a way that makes us responsible. The key point is that being determined doesn't mean we're not responsible. It just means that our choices are part of a bigger plan. So when people say we're like pets or puppets, they're missing the important difference between us and those things. We have the ability to understand and act on our choices, even if those choices are determined. In both of these arguments, the main issue is whether determinism, the idea that everything is determined, is compatible with moral responsibility, the idea that we can be held accountable for our actions. Calvinists believe that it is, and that even if God determines everything, we still have the freedom and understanding to be responsible for our choices. Imagine this. If a dog mauls a mail carrier, we don't blame the dog. We might get rid of the dog, but we don't think the dog is morally responsible for its actions. After all, the dog doesn't have the ability to think about right and wrong in the way humans do. It just acts on its instincts and training. Now, some people argue that if humans are determined, meaning our choices are shaped by factors outside our control, like our upbringing or genes, then we shouldn't be morally responsible for our actions either. They say that just like a dog acting on instinct, a human acting on determined factors isn't really making a free choice. If this is true, then a killer shouldn't be blamed for murder any more than a dog should be blamed for mauling a mail carrier. One key issue is the idea that humans and pets are similar in a way that makes them both not morally responsible. This is where the argument falls apart. The main difference is that humans have self-consciousness. We are aware of our actions and the consequences of those actions. We can think about what is right and wrong, and we can reflect on our choices. Pets and puppets lack this self-awareness. They act based on instinct or programming, not on moral reasoning. So even if determinism is true, humans still have a level of self-consciousness that allows us to be morally responsible for our actions. This self-consciousness is a crucial factor that pets and puppets lack. It's what makes us different and capable of being held accountable for our choices. Another way to look at it is to consider the weaker claim. There is at least one relevant similarity between pets and determined humans, but this claim is too vague to be useful. It's like saying there's some reason why a rock and a tree are similar without telling us what that reason is. It doesn't help us understand why determinism would make humans not responsible for their actions. Incompatibilists might argue that if determinism is true, then it's like we're being coerced into our actions. Coercion means being forced to do something against your will, but determinism doesn't mean we're being forced. Instead, it means that our choices are influenced by factors like our environment and experiences. We still make choices, and we're still aware of those choices. For example, if a robber threatens you with a gun and forces you to give them your money, that's coercion. You didn't choose to give the money, you were forced. But if you decide to go to a certain college because your parents encouraged you and you saw the benefits, that's not coercion. You still made the choice, even if your parents' influence played a role. In the same way, even if our choices are determined, we still make those choices with self-awareness. We're not being forced against our will, so we can still be held responsible for our actions. Some incompatibilists argue that if determinism is true, then all human choices are coerced. They say that if God has determined everything, then we're being forced to make certain choices, and we can't be held responsible for those choices. But this argument has a major flaw. Coercion involves force or threats. For example, if someone holds a gun to your head and tells you to give them your wallet, you're being coerced. You're forced to do something against your will. But determinism doesn't involve force or threats. On a compatibilist view, God doesn't force us to make choices. Instead, God influences our hearts and minds in a way that aligns with our own desires and wills. Think of it like this. If you decide to go to a party because your friends invited you and it sounds fun, you're not being coerced. You're making a choice based on your desires and the influence of your friends. Similarly, if God influences us to make choices that align with our own wills, it's not coercion. We're still making choices, and we're still responsible for those choices. The key point is that coercion involves force or threats, and determinism, as understood by compatibilists, doesn't involve those things. So, the argument that determinism entails coercion is false. Incompatibilists might argue that if we can't identify what makes an action coerced without appealing to determinism, then maybe determinism is the only way to identify coercion. But this is a flawed argument. Just because we don't have a complete understanding of coercion doesn't mean that determinism is the only way to identify it. We know that coercion involves force or threats, and determinism doesn't involve those things. So, even if we don't have a complete definition of coercion, we know that determinism isn't coercion. In the end, the arguments by analogy and coercion both fail to show that determinism is incompatible with moral responsibility. Humans are different from pets and puppets because we have self-consciousness, and determinism doesn't involve the force or threats that are necessary for coercion. So we can still be held responsible for our actions, even if determinism is true. When we talk about free will and moral responsibility, we often bump into tricky questions. One of these questions is whether determinism, the idea that everything that happens is determined by what happened before it, makes it impossible for us to be morally responsible for our actions. Some people, called incompatibilists, think it does. They argue that if determinism is true, then our choices are not really free, and therefore we can't be held responsible for them. But is this argument really strong? Let's take a closer look at one of their main points. The idea that determinism is like coercion or manipulation. First, let's think about coercion. When someone is coerced, they are forced to do something they don't want to do. For example, if a robber points a gun at you and demands your wallet, you might give it to them, but you wouldn't be responsible for the theft because you were coerced. Incompatibilists sometimes argue that if determinism is true, then all our choices are like being coerced. They say that if our choices are determined by prior events, we don't have a real choice, and therefore, we can't be responsible for them. When we talk about determinism, we're saying that everything that happens is caused by what came before it. It's like a big chain of events that can be traced back to the beginning of time. Some people think that if determinism is true, then we can't really be free or responsible for our actions. They say that if everything is determined, then our choices are just the result of things outside our control and we're being manipulated. But is this really true? Does determinism mean that we're being manipulated all the time? Let's dive into this a bit more. First, let's think about what manipulation means. When someone is manipulated, it usually means that their choices are being influenced or controlled in a way that isn't fair or honest. For example, if someone gives you a drug that makes you do something you wouldn't normally do, that's manipulation. Or if someone lies to you to get you to make a choice, that's also manipulation. Now, let's compare this to determinism. Determinism says that everything is caused by what came before it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is actively controlling or influencing your choices. In fact, many people who believe in determinism also believe that we can still make free choices. They argue that even if our choices are determined, they can still be our own choices, coming from our own desires and character. One way to think about this is to imagine a story. In this story, there's a person named Alex. Alex is a kind and generous person who was raised in a loving family one day. Alex decides to help a stranger in need. If we believe in determinism, we might say that Alex's decision to help the stranger was determined by Alex's character and the way Alex was raised. But does this mean that Alex was manipulated? Not at all. Alex's decision came from Alex's own heart and was a genuine expression of who Alex is. Now, let's consider what some people call influencing manipulation. This is when someone or something subtly influences your choices in a way that you might not even notice. For example, if a friend keeps talking about how much they love a certain movie and you end up watching it because of their enthusiasm, that could be seen as influencing manipulation. But is this the same as determinism? Not really. In the case of determinism, our choices are shaped by our character and past experiences, but they are still our choices. In the case of influencing manipulation, the influence is coming from an outside source and is trying to change your choices in a way that isn't aligned with your true self. When we talk about overriding manipulation, it's even clearer that determinism and manipulation are different. Overriding manipulation is when someone directly interferes with your choices, like if someone forces you to do something against your will. This is clearly different from determinism, where our choices are shaped by our own character and desires, not by external forces. So, why do some people think that determinism is like manipulation? One reason is that they see a similarity in the way choices are influenced. They might say if our choices are determined by things outside our control, then isn't that the same as being manipulated? But this isn't a fair comparison. In manipulation, the influence is external and often unfair. In determinism, the influence comes from our own character and past experiences, which are part of who we are. To make this clearer, let's think about a different example. Imagine you have a set of values and desires that are deeply ingrained in you. These values and desires come from your upbringing, your experiences, and your own personality. When you make a choice, it's based on these values and desires. Even if your choices are determined by these factors, they are still your choices because they come from who you are. This is very different from being manipulated, where your choices are influenced by external factors that are not part of your true self. In fact, many people who believe in determinism argue that our choices are more genuine and free when they come from our own character and desires. They say that if our choices are truly our own, then we are still responsible for them, even if they are determined. So when incompatibilists, people who believe that determinism and free will are incompatible, argue that determinism is like manipulation, they are missing a key point. They are assuming that any influence on our choices is the same as manipulation, but this isn't true. The influence that comes from our own character and desires is different from the influence that comes from external manipulation. In the end, the key difference between determinism and manipulation is that determinism is about choices being shaped by our own character and past, while manipulation is about choices being influenced or controlled by external forces. This means that determinism doesn't necessarily exclude moral responsibility, while manipulation does. These ideas fit well with the concept that our moral responsibility comes from our true self, which is shaped by God. Think of it like this. When we talk about someone's true self, or the idea of owning our choices, we're trying to figure out what makes a choice real and free. My view is that the source of this real self, or choice ownership, is God, who created us. One big question that might come up is whether this idea is just a way to get around the problem. After all, if God is in control, why doesn't that make us puppets? But here's the thing. God is different from us. When we try to control someone, it usually means we're taking away their freedom. But God, being God, is the creator of everything, including our freedom. As Paul Helm, a philosopher, puts it, when one creature controls another, the controlled one might lose some responsibility. But when God does it, it's different. God is the one who gives life, and he can take it away, as the Bible says. I kill and make alive, I wound and I heal. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 39. And the Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. 1 Samuel 2:6. So, it makes sense that God can guide our choices in a way that we can't. Think about it this way. Just like God can decide who lives and dies, he can also guide our choices without it being manipulation. It's not arbitrary because God is our creator. Just like a piece of art is authentic if it comes from the artist's true inspiration and not from someone else's alterations, our choices are authentic if they come from our God-given nature and not from external manipulation. Another way to look at it is through examples like beauty and sports. A person's natural beauty is considered genuine because it's God-given, not because of plastic surgery. Similarly, an athlete's performance is praised when it comes from their natural abilities, not from using performance-enhancing drugs. So, it's not surprising that our moral choices should also be rooted in our God-given nature. If God created us, then our true authentic self is found in how God made us, not in how others try to change us. Now, some might say that this only works if God exists. What if the world is just determined by the laws of nature with no God involved? In that case, it's harder to see a difference between manipulation and normal, determined choices. If there's no God, then maybe manipulation arguments do show that moral responsibility doesn't work with determinism. But if God does exist, then my argument holds up. God can do things we can't, like guiding our choices without it being manipulation. One more objection might be about the idea of original sin. If our sinful nature comes from Adam, and that's a human-caused problem, doesn't that mean our choices are manipulated? But there are a couple of ways to look at this. First, Adam's action doesn't fit the definition of manipulation I've talked about. He didn't send us misinformation or control our brains. Second, if you think about it, the judgment for Adam's sin comes from God, not Adam. God is the one who judges and applies the consequences of the fall to our nature. This is still God's doing as our Creator, and it doesn't take away our moral responsibility. Our characters, even with the fallen nature, are still God-given in the relevant sense. Let's apply this to some specific arguments. One famous one is the four-case argument by Dirk Perboom. He tells a story about Professor Plum who kills Ms. White and changes a few details in each case to show that manipulation and determinism are the same when it comes to moral responsibility. In the first case, Plum is controlled by neuroscientists who make him think and act in a certain way. It's clear that Plum isn't responsible here because he's being manipulated. In the second case, the neuroscientists programmed Plum a long time ago, but the result is the same. Plum still isn't responsible because he's being manipulated, even if it happened long ago. In the third case, things get interesting. Plum is now a normal person, but he was raised in a very strict environment that made him act in a certain way. Is Plum responsible now? It depends. If the strict upbringing was a form of manipulation that went too far, then Plum isn't responsible. But if it was just normal parenting, then Plum's choices are still his own, coming from his God-given nature. So, in this case, Plum can be responsible because his choices are free from improper manipulation. By looking at these cases, we can see that my idea of God-givenness helps explain why Plum can be responsible in some cases and not in others. It's not just special pleading, it's a real difference based on whether the choices come from a person's true God-given self or from external manipulation. In the end, the idea that determinism and mental illness are similar is not a good reason to think that determinism and moral responsibility can't coexist. As long as our choices come from our own desires and character, we can still be responsible for them, even in a deterministic world.